Her small voice cracked through the winter air sharper than the wind off the bay. "Please, don't hurt us," Sophie whispered, clutching her little brother as if her arms were the last wall between him and the world. Richard Hale, a man who owned half the skyline of San Francisco, froze. For the first time in years, his fortune felt useless, and in that alley a secret waited that would change everything. "Where are you watching this from tonight?" Richard Hale's name sat on glass towers across San Francisco's skyline, but when the city's lights glittered on Christmas Eve, he found himself walking streets where no one knew him. The night was cold, the kind that bit through wool and leather, but Richard barely noticed. His penthouse high above Market Street was glowing with holiday garlands placed there by assistants. He wasn't going back yet. Not to the silence that always waited. Earlier that evening, he had stood in a ballroom of 300 guests, mayors, investors, celebrities, each one sipping champagne beneath chandeliers he had imported from Venice. They toasted, his success marveled at his latest development along the waterfront, and praised his generosity for funding a new art wing at Stanford. Richard had smiled, shaken hands, and quietly slipped away before dessert. He always did. He could buy applause but not belonging. Now he walked alone near the Embarcadero, shoes crunching against the damp pavement. The bay air carried a tang of salt and diesel from the ferries. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket for the 10th time, holiday greetings from board members, photos of champagne glasses clinked by people who pretended to love him. Not one message carried warmth. Not one voice called him dad, uncle, or even friend. He silenced the phone and shoved it away as if it had betrayed him. Richard stopped at Pier 39, where families were still gathered around the giant Christmas tree laughing under scarves and mittens. A father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders to see the ornaments higher up. Richard looked away quickly, as if the sight was too sharp, and crossed into a quieter street. The further he walked, the dimmer the lights became. San Francisco's postcard glow gave way to cracked sidewalks, shuttered shops, and alleys where holiday songs did not reach. That was when he heard it. A sound so soft it almost blended with the hiss of the wind. A child's sob. He froze. For a moment, he thought it was a trick of memory, an echo of something from his own boyhood when his father's voice had been thunder and his mother's silence heavier than storms. But the sound came again. Fragile. Real. He followed it. Behind a narrow bookstore cafe in the shadows where dumpsters leaned against a wall, Richard saw a small figure crouched low. A girl. No older than 7. She wore a faded pink hoodie, much too thin for December. Her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped tight around something she refused to let go. Her face was blotched red from cold strands of hair stuck damp against her cheeks. She looked up suddenly, and her eyes widened in terror. "Please don't hurt us," she whispered, the words tumbling out in broken gasps. Her voice cut him sharper than any boardroom betrayal ever had. Richard lifted both hands, palms open as if facing a wild creature ready to bolt. "I won't," he said quickly. His voice sounded unfamiliar to him, softer, stripped of the usual iron he carried when giving orders. "You're safe." But the girl did not move. She clutched tighter at the bundle in her arms. Richard leaned closer, heart knocking against his ribs. It wasn't a bundle, it was a boy. A toddler, maybe 4 years old, his face half hidden beneath the hood of a threadbare jacket. His eyes were closed, lashes wet with tears. Richard caught the faint tremor of his lips as he whispered in his sleep. The girl shook her head fiercely, shielding him. "He's my brother," she said. "Don't take him." Richard's throat closed. In all his years chasing contracts worth billions, he had never felt so disarmed. He lowered himself slowly to one knee, ignoring the sting of damp concrete seeping into his tailored trousers. "I'm not here to take him," he said. "I just want to know if you're all right." Her chin trembled. "We're fine." The lie cracked in the cold air. Richard glanced around the alley. Broken glass glittered near the drain. A cardboard box sagged against the wall. The children had no coats, no gloves, nothing but a stuffed bear poking from the girl's backpack. His chest tightened, anger rising not at them but at the unseen cruelty that had pushed them here. The same city that applauded him for building towers had failed to build shelter for its smallest souls. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the street as if expecting someone dangerous to appear. Finally, she whispered, "Sophie." "And your brother Ethan." Her arms tightened around him. "He's 4. He gets sick when it's cold." Richard swallowed hard, unable to look away from the boy's thin wrists. Something in him shifted, a crack running through the armor he had built around himself. He remembered being Ethan's age, standing alone in a hospital corridor the night his father collapsed, hearing relatives murmur about inheritances before the body was even cold. He had learned early that money built walls, not warmth. Sophie's voice pulled him back. "You'll send us away if we go with you. Everyone does." The words stung. How many doors had already slammed on these children? How many adults had looked at them and decided they were someone else's problem? Richard forced his voice steady. "I won't send you away. Not tonight. You don't have to believe me yet. Just let me get you warm, please." The last word startled him. Richard Hale did not beg, not for deals, not for power, not for anything. Yet here he was pleading with a 7-year-old in the shadows of San Francisco. Sophie studied him, suspicion etched deep into her young face. Then Ethan stirred, coughing weakly against her shoulder. That sound decided it. Her grip loosened just enough for Richard to take off his coat and drape it over both of them. Heat spread from his body to theirs, fragile but real. Sophie blinked as if the weight of the fabric surprised her. She didn't thank him, but she didn't push it away either. For Richard, that was enough. In that moment, the man who had built skyscrapers and collected penthouses understood something he had never dared admit. All the glass and steel in the world meant nothing if he could not protect this trembling child right in front of him. The bay wind whipped down the alley, but Richard no longer felt cold. He knew with unnerving clarity that this night, this encounter would alter the course of his life. Richard stood frozen in that alley, the echo of Sophie's whispered plea, "Don't hurt us," still ringing in his ears. The city around him carried on as if nothing had changed, car horns in the distance, faint music spilling from a restaurant 2 streets over. Yet for Richard, time had narrowed to the sight of this girl clutching her little brother like a shield against the world. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without breaking a sweat, but at that moment he struggled for words that wouldn't sound like lies. Sophie's eyes darted to the mouth of the alley, as if expecting shadows to chase her back into hiding. Richard sensed she was ready to run if he moved too quickly. So he stayed low-knees, aching on the pavement, and let the silence stretch. Sometimes silence speaks more than promises. Eventually, he said softly, "There's a diner across the street. Warm food, hot cocoa. Just a few steps. Would you come with me?" Sophie shook her head, clutching Ethan so tightly his small whimper escaped. People stare. They always stare. Her words cut him in a way that award ceremonies never could. Richard glanced toward the diner window where couples laughed over pie, and families shared plates of pancakes at midnight. None of them would stare at him. They would nod, perhaps ask for a selfie. But the same people would look at Sophie and Ethan with suspicion, maybe disgust. He felt shame prickle across his skin. "All right," Richard said gently. "No diner. What about this?" He reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out his car keys. "I parked just around the corner. Heated seats, no crowds, no staring." Sophie's chin lifted slightly. He saw hesitation in her eyes, but also exhaustion. She wanted to believe him, but didn't dare. Then Ethan coughed again, his small chest heaving. That was the breaking point. Sophie didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She let Richard help her to her feet. Richard led the way toward the street, but not too quickly, not too confidently, careful to let Sophie feel in control. When they reached the curb, the sight of his black sedan with tinted windows seemed almost obscene against the fragility of two children shivering on the sidewalk. He opened the back door and Sophie climbed in with Ethan still in her arms, keeping her body angled like a wall between her brother and the stranger offering help. The moment the doors shut and the heater hummed to life, Richard saw the tension in Sophie's shoulders loosen just slightly. Ethan stirred, blinking awake. His small voice cracked the silence. "Sophie." She kissed his forehead. "It's okay. Just warm now." Richard caught the look in her eyes, equal parts defiance and hope. She had been carrying the weight of a guardian far too long for a child of 7. Driving through the quiet streets of San Francisco, Richard tried not to pepper them with questions, though 1,000 burned inside him. He wanted to know where they had come from, who had failed them, why Sophie's voice carried the brittle edge of someone who no longer believed in safe places. But he kept his words simple. "Hungry?" he asked. Sophie hesitated, then nodded once. They stopped at an all-night corner market, one of those narrow stores glowing under buzzing fluorescent lights. Richard walked in first, leaving the car running. He grabbed sandwiches, fruit cups, chocolate milk, and a soft fleece blanket from a rack meant for tourists who underestimated the bay wind. When he returned, Sophie's eyes widened at the pile he carried. She shook her head. "We can't pay." Richard placed the food carefully between them. "You don't have to." The first bite of sandwich seemed to unlock something. Sophie ate quickly, almost guiltily, glancing at her brother to make sure he ate more than she did. Ethan clutched the chocolate milk with both hands and smiled through a straw, the kind of smile that made Richard's chest ache. Children should not look grateful for basic survival. When Sophie finally spoke again, her voice was softer. "Why are you helping us people usually walk by?" Richard gripped the steering wheel, staring at the empty intersection ahead. "Because I couldn't walk by this time." He left it at that. The truth was more complicated about his own loneliness, about the ghosts of his childhood, but he knew those weren't answers a 7-year-old needed. The city outside blurred by neon lights, fading into quieter streets as he drove aimlessly. He had no plan beyond keeping them safe tonight. Eventually, Sophie broke the silence again. "You'll call someone, won't you, to take us away?" The question landed heavy. Richard thought of the network of foster homes of children, shuffled from one stranger to another, siblings torn apart, case files gathering dust. He thought of Sophie's trembling voice in that alley begging not to be taken. "No," he said firmly. "I won't call anyone tonight. You stay with me until we figure it out." She studied him, suspicious but weary. Then she leaned her head back against the seat, still holding Ethan. For the first time, her eyes closed. Richard drove to his apartment tower, the one overlooking the Bay Bridge. The doorman blinked in surprise when he saw the children bundled in the back seat, but Richard's glare cut off any question. Inside the lobby's marble glow, Sophie shrank into herself again, clutching Ethan tighter. Richard knelt beside her. "No one here will touch you. Just follow me." Up in the penthouse, the contrast was jarring. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened onto a skyline glittering with holiday lights. Glass tables gleamed art pieces hung on pristine walls. It was a kingdom built for one man, not two children who smelled faintly of damp alleys. Sophie hesitated at the threshold as though afraid to dirty the floor. Richard noticed and quickly spread the blanket across the sofa. "Here," he said. "This is yours tonight. She settled Ethan down, brushing his hair back with tenderness. Only a parent should know. Richard watched silently, realizing with a pang that this girl had been forced to grow up in ways that stripped childhood from her. He disappeared briefly into the guest bathroom and returned with a warm towel and soap. Sophie eyed it, then glanced at him warily. "For him?" Richard said quickly, nodding toward Ethan. "Warm water feels good after the cold." A half hour later, Ethan slept under the fleece blanket, his small breath steady. Sophie sat upright on the edge of the couch, her knees hugged to her chest. She looked out at the glittering bridge lights, then back at Richard. "If we fall asleep, will you still be here when we wake up?" The question pierced deeper than she could know. Richard had walked out of countless rooms in his life meetings, galas, even relationships never staying long enough to see what happened after. But tonight was different. He sat in the armchair across from her, loosened his tie, and said, "Yes, I'll be right here." Her eyes searched his face, perhaps looking for cracks in his promise. Then, slowly, she lay down beside her brother. Within minutes, her breathing evened. Richard stayed awake, watching the two small figures curled together on his sofa beneath the glow of the city lights. He had spent his life building towers that touched the sky, but he realized he had never built anything that truly mattered. And as Sophie's final whispered plea replayed in his mind, "Don't hurt us," he understood that for the first time in years, someone's safety, someone's tomorrow rested in his hands, and he was terrified of failing them. The morning sun slipped through the glass walls of Richard's penthouse, spilling across white marble floors that had never known such clutter. Two small shoes lay abandoned near the coffee table. A chocolate milk carton stood empty on the counter, and a fleece blanket with cartoon stars draped across the sofa where Sophie and Ethan still slept. Richard stood barefoot at the window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching them with the quiet awe of a man who had stumbled into a life he did not understand. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, Sophie's voice returned, "If we fall asleep, will you still be here?" He had promised yes, and he had kept it, but the weight of that promise pressed heavier than any contract he had ever signed. When Ethan stirred, blinking awake, Richard set his coffee down and crouched beside the couch. "Morning, buddy," he said softly. The boy blinked at him, confused, then whispered, "We're not outside." Richard shook his head. "Not today." Sophie woke next, protective as ever, immediately checking her brother before she looked at Richard. Suspicion still lingered in her eyes, but less sharp than the night before. He had the hotel chef send up pancakes and scrambled eggs, though he carried the trays himself to avoid frightening them with strangers. At first, Sophie refused to eat, claiming she wasn't hungry, but when Ethan began devouring forkfuls of eggs, she relented. She cut his food into smaller pieces before taking any for herself. Richard watched the ritual with a mix of admiration and sorrow, a child who had learned too soon to put herself last. After breakfast, Richard realized the children needed more than food and warmth. They needed space to breathe, to play, to feel human again. He pulled 2 coats from his closet, oversized, expensive wool pieces he had never worn, and adjusted them around Sophie and Ethan. They looked ridiculous, swallowed by fabric, but when Ethan giggled at the sight, something unknotted inside Richard's chest. He took them to Golden Gate Park. The morning air was crisp, the grass still jeweled with dew. Children's laughter floated from the playground, mingling with the distant strum of a street musician's guitar. Sophie hesitated at the park entrance, holding Ethan's hand tightly. "We don't belong," she murmured. Richard knelt to meet her eyes. "You belong more than I do. Come on." At first, they stood awkwardly, watching other children run and climb. Then Ethan broke free, bolting toward the swings. His laughter rang out high and unrestrained, and Sophie's face softened. She followed slowly, sitting on a swing beside him. Richard pushed them gently, his expensive shoes sinking into the damp mulch, his tailored coat streaked with dust. For once, he didn't care. Sophie gripped the chains tightly, her hair flying back, and a smile cracked across her face, tentative but real. Richard memorized it. Later, they wandered through the Japanese tea garden, where koi shimmered beneath bridges, and cherry blossoms clung stubbornly to branches, despite the winter chill. Sophie paused at the water's edge, watching the fish swirl. "Mom used to tell me stories about goldfish," she said quietly, almost to herself. She said they never stop swimming even when they're tired. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to ask more, but she pressed her lips together and walked ahead. Some memories were still too raw to share. That afternoon, back at the penthouse, Sophie surprised him. She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her backpack and spread it on the coffee table. It was a drawing, done in shaky crayon lines, 3 stick figures standing beneath a big sun. One had the short, dark hair, one had braids, and one was tiny with a wide smile. Above them, in crooked letters, Sophie had written, "Family." Richard stared at the drawing, his chest aching in a way he hadn't expected. "Is this us?" he asked quietly. Sophie shrugged, defensive. "It's just a picture." But when Ethan toddled over, pointing at the tallest figure and announcing, "That's you," her cheeks flushed. She tried to snatch the paper back, but Richard shook his head. "No, I'd like to keep it." He folded it carefully, sliding it into his wallet beside his driver's license. Sophie watched, stunned that he treated it like something precious. Over the next days, small rituals began to form. Richard cooked with them, though his version of cooking was clumsy. He burned grilled cheese sandwiches and oversalted soup, but Sophie laughed at his attempts, correcting him with the authority of someone who had learned to fend for herself. She showed him how to stir gently, how to taste, before adding more. Ethan sat on the counter banging a spoon against a pot, conducting the chaos like a tiny maestro. For the first time in years, the sterile penthouse smelled of food and laughter. At night, Richard discovered that Sophie could not sleep easily. She would toss and turn her eyes, snapping open at every creak. One evening, he found her curled in the corner of the sofa long after Ethan had drifted off. "Bad dreams?" he asked. She nodded, silent. He hesitated, then sat down beside her. "When I was your age, I used to count stars out my window when I couldn't sleep. Want to try?" They stood together by the vast window wall, city lights twinkling like constellations. Richard pointed out the Bay Bridge, its cables glittering like threads of silver. "Not stars?" Sophie said softly, "but they'll do." For the first time, she leaned lightly against his side. The contact was fleeting, but it rooted something deeper than any skyscraper he had ever built. By the end of the week, Richard noticed a change in himself as much as in them. The constant ping of emails and calls from his office no longer stirred urgency. He let meetings slip, deadlines pass. His assistant left a string of increasingly frantic messages, but Richard didn't listen. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the living room rug, helping Ethan build towers from wooden blocks, and letting Sophie braid his hair with ribbons she had found in a drawer. He, the man, once allergic to disorder, laughed when the towers collapsed, and let her crown him with ribbons, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. One evening, Sophie surprised him again. She climbed onto the sofa, clutching a book she had found in the guest room, a children's classic, its spine cracked. "Read," she demanded simply. Richard chuckled. "I haven't read aloud in years." "You can try," she replied, settling beside him. So he did. His voice was stiff at first, too formal, but as Sophie curled against his shoulder and Ethan snuggled on his lap, the words began to flow. By the end of the chapter, Sophie's breathing had slowed into sleep. Ethan's tiny hand gripped his sleeve like an anchor. Richard closed the book and sat there in silence, the weight of both children warm against him. He realized then that trust is not won with promises or money. It is built quietly, brick by brick, in laughter over burnt dinners and drawings folded into wallets and stars counted at midnight, in the small hand of a child that finally rests without fear. And as he held them both, Richard knew that whatever battles lay ahead, he would fight them not as a lonely millionaire, but as something entirely new, someone who had finally begun to learn what family meant. The quiet rhythm Richard had built with Sophie and Ethan was soon interrupted by a knock at his door that shattered the illusion of safety. A social worker stood in the hallway, clipboard in hand, her expression practiced and neutral. She had received reports, she said, about 2 minors now living in his residence. Richard let her in, but the moment Sophie saw the woman's badge, her face drained of color. She clutched Ethan's arm and whispered, "They're going to take us." Richard crouched beside her. "No one is taking you anywhere he promised, though he wasn't sure he had the power to keep it." The social worker's questions came like blows. What right did he have to shelter them? Was he aware of the procedures? Did he understand how complex guardianship was? Richard answered calmly but firmly, insisting that the children were safe here, safer than they had ever been. Still, he knew this was only the beginning. Days later, word arrived that a distant relative had surfaced. Margaret, the children's aunt from Los Angeles, had filed for custody. She painted herself as the rightful guardian, the blood family who could give them stability. Yet, when Richard read the legal notice, his instincts screamed. He had seen too many people chase inheritances, not responsibilities. Something in Sophie's eyes when she heard Margaret's name confirmed his suspicion. "She never wanted us," Sophie whispered. "She told Mom we were a burden." The case moved quickly to court. Richard found himself seated at a long oak table the children kept elsewhere with a counselor, their absence heavier than their presence had ever been. Margaret arrived, dressed in tailored severity, her lawyer speaking of blood ties and legal rights. They portrayed Richard as an interloper, a wealthy man grasping at sentiment he could never sustain. "He is not related to the boy at all," the attorney argued, "and his connection to Sophie is only recent and unproven. This is an emotional whim, not a plan." Richard's attorney countered with medical records, photographs, and statements from child specialists, evidence of bruises of neglect of nights spent hungry. He spoke of Richard's provision of care, medical checkups, schooling enrollment, a home that had been more than shelter. But evidence alone could not capture what Richard felt in his chest. When the judge asked if he wished to speak, he rose slowly, hands steady, though his heart raced. "I didn't know Sophie and Ethan existed until the night I found them," he began. "But when I saw them, I recognized something I had been missing all my life. Responsibility, belonging, love. I can't undo the hurt they've endured, but I can promise it will never happen again, not while I live. Family is not always blood. Sometimes it is the choice to stay, the choice to protect." The courtroom grew still. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her mask of composure slipping. Yet it was not Richard's words alone that swayed the balance. The door opened, and Sophie entered, small shoes tapping across polished wood. Her presence startled everyone. She walked straight to the bench and looked up at the judge with clear, steady eyes. "She says she's family," Sophie said, pointing toward Margaret. "But she yelled a lot. She scared Ethan. She told me I was too loud too much, that nobody wanted us. She made us sleep in the basement. But Richard, he listens. He buys us blankets, he reads stories even when they're boring. He never yells, he never leaves. That's what a dad does right." The words pierced through legal jargon sharper than any argument could. The judge leaned forward. "Do you feel safe with him?" Sophie nodded. "I feel like I can breathe." Margaret tried to object, her lawyer rising in indignation, but the gavel struck hard. The judge's tone left no room for debate. "Enough. This court rules in the best interest of the children, and the evidence is clear. Full guardianship of Sophie and Ethan will be granted to Richard Hale. The room blurred for Richard. Relief, disbelief, and a wave of gratitude all collided inside him. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Outside the courthouse, snow began to fall, lightly unusual for San Francisco, but somehow fitting. Sophie ran into his arms, clinging to his neck, and Ethan, bundled in Richard's coat, pressed his small face into his shoulder. "Does this mean you're really ours?" Sophie whispered. Richard cupped her cheek, his voice rough with emotion. "I was yours the moment I found you. This just makes it official." For the first time in decades, the lonely millionaire felt something richer than fortune, more binding than contracts. He had not only won a case, he had been entrusted with 2 lives. And he knew, with absolute certainty, this was the only legacy that mattered. The house by the bay was smaller than the penthouse, but Richard chose it deliberately. It wasn't built for grandeur, it was built for living. White shutters framed the windows, a swing hung from an old oak tree, and sunlight spilled across the porch each morning. For Sophie and Ethan, it was not just a house, it was proof that they finally had a place where laughter didn't have to hide. On their first morning there, Sophie darted from room to room, her braids flying, discovering the bookshelf already stocked with storybooks, the desk waiting for her drawings, the star-shaped nightlight that glowed softly in her bedroom. Ethan toddled behind her, squealing each time he found something new. Richard watched them both, his chest tightening with something that felt almost foreign at first, but was becoming familiar pride. He had not built this house with glass and steel. He had built it with intention, brick by brick, for them. Life took on a new rhythm. In the evenings, Richard cooked dinner, sometimes edible, sometimes a disaster. Sophie teased him mercilessly when he burned toast, and Ethan clapped whenever the smoke alarm went off, as if it were part of the entertainment. They ate together at the wooden dining table, a table that bore spilled milk, crayon marks, and crumbs, but also conversations that stitched them closer. Sophie would talk about school assignments, Ethan about nothing at all, except dinosaurs and colors, and Richard would listen as if every word mattered more than any business proposal ever had. Saturdays became their adventure days. One week, it was a picnic at Crissy Field with the Golden Gate Bridge stretching across the horizon, Sophie flying a kite while Ethan chased seagulls. Another week, they wandered the exploratorium where Ethan pressed his hands against glowing exhibits, and Sophie tugged Richard from one experiment to the next, demanding explanations. He didn't always know the answers, but he loved the way her eyes lit when he tried. At night, the routine ended with story time. Sophie insisted he read every word, even the long ones. Ethan usually fell asleep halfway, his head heavy against Richard's chest. When the book closed, Sophie would whisper, "You'll be here tomorrow," and Richard would always reply, "Every tomorrow you want me." Over time, she stopped asking. She simply knew. One spring afternoon, Sophie pulled Richard into the garden where she had planted sunflower seeds. She knelt in the dirt, pointing proudly at the first green shoots breaking through the soil. "This one is mine, that one is Ethan's, and that one's yours," she declared, then paused, placing a small wooden marker into the earth. "And this one is for Mom." Richard crouched beside her, his throat tightening. "She loved sunflowers," Sophie said softly. "She said they always looked like they were smiling." Richard placed his hand over hers, nodding. "Then this garden will always smile with her." The house filled with drawings, taped to the fridge framed on the walls tucked under Richard's papers. Sophie drew them at the park at the kitchen table, sometimes late into the night. One day, she emerged with a framed picture she had worked on secretly. It showed the 3 of them standing on a hill of blooming sunflowers. Above them floated a figure with wings and a crown of petals. Beneath, in her careful handwriting, were the words, "You stayed." Richard held the drawing for a long moment, blinking away the sting in his eyes. When Sophie whispered, "It's for you," he pulled her into his arms, and Ethan squeezed in between them, a giggling bundle of love that broke the weight of grief with pure joy. That evening they built a blanket fort in the living room. Pillows became walls chairs, supported quilts, and Sophie strung fairy lights across the ceiling. Inside, they ate popcorn from paper bowls and told stories, Sophie reading her own made-up tales, Ethan chiming in with nonsense, and Richard laughing until his stomach ached. When the lights dimmed and the children finally slept beside him, Richard stayed awake listening to their steady breathing. He thought of the man he had been alone, cold, despite the wealth surrounding him, building towers that touched the sky but never touched his heart. Now, holding the world in his arms, he knew the true meaning of fortune. As the months passed, paperwork turned into permanence. The court finalized Ethan's adoption, and Richard signed the documents with a steady hand. His lawyer congratulated him, but Richard only glanced at the two children waiting in the hallway and thought, "This is the only contract that matters." That night, when Sophie asked what it meant, he knelt and said, "It means I'm not just staying for now. I'm staying forever." She didn't answer with words. She simply wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "Then we're home." The lonely millionaire was lonely no more. Under the rising sun of San Francisco Bay, with a swing creaking in the oak tree, and sunflowers smiling in the garden, Richard Hale learned that wealth without love was empty, but love once found turned even the smallest house into a kingdom. A new dawn had begun not in the skyline he had built, but in the hearts that now called him Dad. Richard Hale's story began in silence, and Glass Tower's a man who thought he had everything yet owned nothing that truly mattered. His life shifted the night Sophie's trembling voice pleaded in the dark alley, "Don't hurt us." In that single moment, the lonely millionaire was confronted not by another deal or a fleeting gala, but by two fragile lives who carried more courage than he had ever known. From that night forward, the walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. Sophie, barely 7, guarded her little brother Ethan with a fierceness that spoke of pain too great for a child. Richard, who had once measured value in contracts and assets, discovered that true worth lay in the quiet rituals of trust, burnt toast, shared at a messy table, bedtime stories read until voices grew hoarse, drawings folded into wallets like treasures. Together they built something money could never buy family. But shadows always return, and theirs came in the form of courtrooms' paperwork and voices from the past claiming rights they had long abandoned. Richard faced his own doubts, wondering if love could stand against law and blood. Yet, when Sophie stood before the judge, her small voice steady, declaring, "He never leaves." That's what a dad does right. It was not wealth or influence that won the day, but love spoken honestly. The gavel fell, and with it the final chain of fear broke. What began as chance in a cold alley grew into a new dawn by the bay. The house Richard chose was not the tallest tower, but a home filled with laughter, spilled milk, and sunflower gardens that smiled with memory. Ethan's giggles, Sophie's drawings, and Richard's quiet promises became the foundation of a legacy richer than any skyline he once dreamed of. He was no longer the lonely millionaire. He was Dad. And what can we take from this story? That family is not defined by blood alone, but by the choice to stay when it would be easier to walk away. That the greatest wealth we can hold is not in our bank accounts, but in the arms of those who call us theirs. Sophie's plea, "Don't hurt us," was answered not with words, but with presence with every tomorrow Richard chose to remain. In our own lives, we are often consumed by achievement, distracted by the noise of ambition. But perhaps what matters most are the small, steady choices, listening without judgment, offering warmth when the world feels cold, daring to stay when someone needs us most. These are the bricks that build a life of meaning. If this story moved you, let it be more than a tale. Let it be a reminder that every act of kindness has the power to rewrite someone's tomorrow. And if you believe in stories that touch the heart and remind us of what truly matters, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these journeys of hope, love, and second chances. Together, let's keep building a community where no one feels alone.